The mud from the horse trough had soaked through Eliza Bannon's worn dress completely, leaving brown stains that marked her as clearly as any scarlet letter. She clutched her 3-month-old son Thomas against her chest, feeling his tiny body shiver in the October cold of the Wyoming Territory. The main street of Crow's Landing stretched before them, dusty and unwelcoming, lined with wooden buildings that housed people who had made their feelings about her abundantly clear. A well-dressed man approached from the general store, his polished boots clicking against the wooden boardwalk. His eyes swept over her disheveled appearance with undisguised contempt. Without breaking stride, he turned his head and spat a stream of tobacco juice that splattered just inches from her feet. "Move along, woman," he muttered, adjusting his gold pocket watch. "Decent folk don't need such sights cluttering up their town." Eliza's hands tightened around Thomas, but she said nothing. 3 weeks in Crow's Landing had taught her that words only made things worse. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations of townspeople emerging from their shops to witness her latest humiliation. "There she goes again," came a woman's sharp voice. "Claims her husband died on the trail, but who's to say she ever had one? Could be she's just another fallen woman looking for sympathy." Thomas began to cry, his thin wails echoing off the storefronts. Eliza had no milk left to give him, no money for food, and nowhere to go. The wilderness beyond town was filled with bears, wolves, and hostile weather that would kill them both within days. But staying meant watching her son slowly starve, while the townspeople treated them like diseased animals. As she turned to walk away, movement in the shadows between 2 buildings caught her eye. A tall figure stood there, motionless, watching everything with dark, intelligent eyes. Unlike the townspeople who stared with disgust or morbid curiosity, this man's gaze held something different, a careful assessment that seemed to look past her muddy dress and desperate circumstances to something deeper. Their eyes met for just a moment before he stepped back into the shadows, leaving Eliza wondering if exhaustion had made her imagine the encounter. But something about that brief connection sparked the first flicker of possibility she had felt in weeks. The past 3 weeks had been a nightmare of systematic rejection. Eliza had arrived in Crow's Landing with nothing but her traveling dress and a newborn whose father had died when their wagon overturned crossing a swollen creek. The wagon train had moved on without her, and she had walked for days until she reached this trading post settlement, hoping to find work and safety. Crow's Landing existed to serve travelers heading west, with a general store, livery stable, small hotel, and church forming its core. The 200 permanent residents valued order and respectability above all else. They were people who had stopped their westward journey to establish roots, and they viewed outsiders with suspicion. Eliza's first mistake had been arriving covered in trail dust, with a story that sounded unlikely to ears unused to frontier hardships. Her second was being young and alone with a baby, a combination that made married women suspicious and unmarried men assume the worst. Her third and most damning mistake was having no family connections, no references, and no money to smooth her acceptance. The town's most influential citizen, Reverend Marcus Whitmore, had been the first to pass judgment. A tall man with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes, he commanded respect through his position as spiritual leader and his ownership of substantial property outside town. When Eliza had approached him for help that first desperate day, he had listened with apparent sympathy. "I can see you're in distress," he had said, his voice carrying practiced pastoral concern. "But you must understand that our community has standards. We cannot simply take in every unfortunate soul who arrives on our doorstep." He had given her a thin wool blanket and advised her to seek the Lord's guidance. The gesture seemed kind, but Eliza soon learned it came with expectations. She was supposed to be grateful, humble, and most importantly, temporary. The livery stable owner, Jeremiah Colt, had been more direct. "I don't hire women," he had declared when she asked for work. "Especially not ones with babies. Horses don't like the smell of milk and crying. When she persisted, explaining her willingness to do any work, Colt had grown angry. "You deaf," I said. "No. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Every other potential employer gave similar responses. Some were polite but firm, others openly hostile, but the result was always the same. Without work, she could not afford lodging. The church's charity extended only to allowing her to sleep in the cemetery, where she would not disturb respectable citizens. For 3 weeks, Eliza had survived on scraps found behind the hotel and general store, supplemented by occasional mercy from passing travelers. She watched her son grow thinner and more fretful, knowing her own dwindling strength would soon fail to produce the milk he needed. The man in the shadows was Chief Wicasa Red Hawk of the Lakota people, though she did not know his identity. His band maintained a semi-permanent camp 5 miles northwest of town, where they had established an uneasy truce with the white settlers. The relationship was complex. The Lakota provided skilled leather work and traded furs, while the townspeople offered manufactured goods and access to supply lines. Wicasa was 42 years old, a veteran of countless conflicts who had learned to navigate the changing world through strength and diplomacy. He had been coming to Crow's Landing for 2 years, observing the settlement's growth and the increasing pressure on his people's traditional lands. He had noticed Eliza from her first day watching, as the community systematically rejected her with cruelty that reminded him of his own people's treatment by less tolerant settlements. Unlike many of his generation, Wicasa had learned to read English from a missionary in his youth, and he understood the complex dynamics of frontier communities. He recognized that Eliza's situation was potentially volatile for everyone involved, as desperate outsiders often became catalysts for larger conflicts. But he also saw something in her determination that intrigued him, a quality that might prove useful in preventing rather than causing trouble. On this particular afternoon, as he watched the man spit near her feet and heard the cruel whispers, Wicasa made a decision that would change everything. He stepped back into the shadows to wait for the right moment to act. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Eliza made her way to the narrow alley behind the hotel where she had discovered the owner sometimes discarded half-eaten meals. Thomas had been crying for hours, and she was desperate enough to risk being caught searching through refuse in the dying light. She had just found a piece of bread that was only slightly moldy when boots scraped on gravel behind her. Turning, she saw 2 men approaching Jake Morrison and Cleet Hawkins cowboys, who worked for one of the larger ranches and were known for their drinking and quick tempers. "Well, well." Jake drawled, his words slurred with whiskey. "Look what we got here, Cleet. The fancy lady from back east dining on garbage like a common rat." Eliza clutched Thomas closer and tried to move past them, but Cleet blocked her path. He was the larger of the two, with arms like tree trunks and a face that had been broken and reset multiple times. Whiskey fumes rolled off him in waves. "Hold on there, Missy." Cleet said, his voice deceptively gentle. "We've been talking about you, and we got a proposition. I just want to pass." Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "That's where you're wrong," Jake replied, stepping closer. "You are bothering folks. A woman like you with a baby living like an animal in the cemetery. It ain't right." Eliza's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. She had heard stories of women in desperate situations being forced to give up their children for the supposed good of the community. Righteous citizens often justified such actions as necessary for innocent babies who deserved better than poverty. "That baby needs proper care." Cleet continued, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "Needs a real family, not some vagrant who can't feed herself. We know a family here that would take him in, raise him proper." "No," Eliza said, backing against the hotel's brick wall. "He's my son. I won't give him up." "Ain't about what you want." Jake said, his hand moving to his knife handle. "It's about what's right, what's Christian." They moved closer, and Eliza realized with growing terror that they intended to take Thomas by force. She pressed against the wall, mind racing for options. She could scream, but who would help her? The townspeople considered her a burden at best. "Please," she whispered, knowing begging was useless, but unable to stop herself. "He's all I have left." "That's the problem," Cleet said, reaching for the baby. "You ain't got nothing to offer him. No food, no home, no future. We're doing you both a favor." Just as his fingers touched Thomas's blanket, a shadow fell across the alley. A voice spoke from the darkness, calm and controlled, but carrying absolute authority. "Step away from the woman." The two cowboys spun around, hands instinctively moving to weapons. Standing at the alley's mouth was a tall figure silhouetted against the dying light. As he stepped forward, Eliza could see he was Native American, with long black hair and clothing that combined traditional and modern elements. Most importantly, he carried a tomahawk and moved with the controlled grace of a seasoned warrior. "This ain't your business, Indian." Jake snarled, though uncertainty colored his voice. "We're dealing with a town matter. The woman is not from your town." The newcomer replied, his English precise. "She owes you nothing. Her child owes you nothing. You have no claim on either." Cleet's hand moved toward his gun, but the Native American was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his tomahawk and held it ready, metal gleaming in the fading light. The message was clear. He was prepared to use it. "You threatening us?" Cleet demanded, though he made no move to draw his weapon. "I am offering you a choice," the man said. "Walk away now unharmed and forget this encounter, or continue on your current path and face the consequences." The cowboys exchanged glances. They were drunk, but not drunk enough to miss that they faced a warrior who had clearly killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. The narrow alley worked against them, limiting their ability to use numbers to advantage. "This ain't over," Jake muttered, but he was already backing away. "The preacher's gonna hear about this, about you interfering." "Tell him," the warrior replied calmly. "Tell him also that Chief Wicasa Red Hawk of the Lakota people has taken this woman under his protection." The cowboys hurried away, leaving Eliza alone with her mysterious savior. She found herself shaking from fear and relief. Thomas had stopped crying and was looking up at the tall man with wide, curious eyes. Wicasa slid his tomahawk back into its sheath and turned to face her. In the dim light, she could see strong, weathered features with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Gray streaked his hair, and lines around his eyes spoke of years facing frontier hardships. "You are the woman living in the cemetery," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Eliza replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you are—" "I am Wicasa Red Hawk. My people have a camp northwest of here." He studied her for a long moment. "You have strength, but strength alone will not keep you and your child alive much longer." Fresh tears threatened to spill over. "I don't know what else to do. No one will hire me. No one will help me. I will help you," Wicasa said simply. "My people have need of extra hands. We require assistance with daily tasks, cooking, caring for animals, mending clothes. In exchange, you and your child will have food and shelter." The offer was so unexpected that Eliza could only stare in stunned silence. After weeks of rejection and cruelty, this stranger's kindness felt almost too good to be true. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "I know enough," Wicasa replied. "I know you have faced hardship with dignity. I know you love your child more than your own life. I know you deserve better than what this town has offered." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm and warm, and for the first time in weeks, Eliza felt something other than despair. "Come," he said. "Tonight you will sleep safely, and tomorrow we will speak of the future." As they walked toward the edge of town, Eliza felt as though she were stepping from one world into another. Behind them, Crow's Landing's lights flickered in the gathering darkness, while ahead lay the unknown territory of the Lakota camp and the possibility of a new beginning. The Lakota camp was nothing like Eliza had imagined. Instead of primitive teepees, she found a collection of well-constructed dwellings that combined traditional design with practical adaptations for Wyoming's harsh climate. Traditional hide teepees stood alongside sturdy log structures reinforced with earth and stone. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and children's laughter mixed with adults' soft conversations as they went about evening routines. Wicasa led her to a small lodge near the camp's center, where several women were preparing food over a large fire. As they approached, conversations stopped, and Eliza found herself scrutinized by dozens of pairs of dark eyes. "This is Eliza," Wicasa announced in English, then repeated the introduction in Lakota. "She and her child will be staying with us." The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some younger people seemed curious, while others appeared skeptical or hostile. An elderly woman with silver-streaked hair and deep lines around her eyes stood up from where she had been tending the fire. She wore a dress made from beautifully worked leather, decorated with intricate beadwork, and her bearing suggested significant authority. "Wicasa," she said, her voice carrying warning. "What have you done?" "I have offered sanctuary to someone who needs it, Ashki," he replied calmly, "as our people have always done." Ashki studied Eliza with sharp, intelligent eyes. When she spoke, her English was heavily accented but clear. "You bring white woman here. White woman with baby. You bring trouble." "I bring someone cast out by her own people," Wicasa countered. "Someone who has shown resolve in the face of hardship." "Resolve." Ashki's voice rose slightly. "What resolve she comes here because she has nowhere else to go? Because she is weak and desperate. We are not a place for white people when their own people reject them." Eliza felt her face burn with shame and anger. She had expected hostility from townspeople, but this rejection felt different, more personal. These people had suffered at white settlers' hands, and she was a living reminder of that suffering. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said, voice steady despite inner turmoil. "I just need work. I can earn my keep." "Earn?" Ashki laughed without humor. "With what you have, nothing. You own nothing. You are nothing." The words hit like physical blows, but Eliza forced herself to stand straighter. Thomas began to cry, perhaps sensing the tension, and she rocked him gently while meeting Ashki's challenging gaze. "I have hands that can work," she said. "I have knowledge of reading and writing. I have determination, even if it doesn't look like much now. You have a baby that cries and needs constant care," Ashki replied. "You have no experience with our ways. You will slow us down and put us at risk." Other voices joined the conversation, some in English, others in Lakota. Eliza could not understand the words, but the tone was clear. She was not welcome, and her presence was seen as potentially harmful. Wicasa listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When the voices died down, he spoke again. "Ashki speaks from wisdom and experience," he said. "Her concerns are valid. But I have watched this woman for weeks. I have seen her maintain dignity in the face of cruelty. I have seen her refuse to abandon her child when it would have been easier. These are qualities we value." "Pretty words," Ashki said. "But what happens when the white men from town come looking for her? What happens when they decide we are harboring their enemy? Then we will deal with that when it comes," Wicasa replied. "For now she stays." The finality in his voice made it clear the discussion was over. Ashki shook her head in disgust and turned back to her cooking, muttering in Lakota. Other women followed her lead, pointedly ignoring Eliza as they resumed their tasks. Wicasa led Eliza to a small shelter at the camp's edge, little more than a lean-to constructed from poles and canvas. But it offered protection from wind and privacy. A buffalo robe had been laid on the ground, and there was a small fire pit surrounded by stones. "This is temporary," he said as he helped her settle Thomas on the soft fur. "Tomorrow, we will find more suitable housing." "I don't think they want me here," Eliza said, looking back toward the main camp where women still gathered around the fire. "They are afraid," Wicasa replied. "My people have learned that white settlers often bring trouble, even unintentionally. Your presence could be seen as provocation by the townspeople." "Then maybe I should leave," Eliza said, though the thought of returning to Crow's Landing filled her with dread. "You will not survive 3 days in the wilderness with a baby," Wicasa said bluntly. "And the townspeople have made clear you are not welcome there. This is your only option." He was right, and they both knew it. Eliza had nowhere else to go, and Thomas needed food and shelter to survive. But the hostility she had encountered was almost as difficult to bear as the rejection she had faced in town. The next morning brought new challenges. Wicasa assigned her to help care for the camp's horses, reasoning it was work that could be done while keeping Thomas close. But Eliza had no experience with horses, and the large animals seemed to sense her nervousness. Her first task was helping water the horses at a stream along the camp's eastern edge. The animals were led there in groups, and she was supposed to help manage them while they drank. But when she approached a large bay stallion, the animal reared up, nearly striking her with its hooves. "Get back," shouted a young Lakota man named Dakota, who quickly moved to control the frightened horse. "You move too fast, make too much noise. You scare him." Eliza stumbled backward, clutching Thomas to her chest. The baby began to cry, which only made the horses more nervous. Several animals began to prance and whinny, requiring 3 experienced handlers to calm them. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to." "You don't know anything about horses," Dakota said angrily. "You could have been killed, or worse, you could have gotten one of us killed." The incident was reported to Wicasa, who listened with a troubled expression. That evening, he came to her shelter to discuss the situation. "You must learn quickly," he said without preamble. "My people's patience is not unlimited. If you cannot contribute to the camp's work, they will demand I send you away." "I want to learn," Eliza said desperately. "I just need time to figure things out." "Time is something we may not have," Wicasa replied. "Already there are whispers in town about your presence here. Some people are saying the Lakota have stolen a white woman and her child. Others claim you are here to spy on us." Eliza felt a chill. She had not considered that her presence might be interpreted as espionage or kidnapping. Such accusations could lead to serious trouble for the entire camp. "What can I do?" she asked. "Prove your worth," Wicasa said simply. "Show my people you are an asset, not a liability. Show them you deserve their protection." As he left her with these thoughts, Eliza realized her struggles were far from over. She had escaped immediate starvation and exposure, but had traded one set of challenges for another. The townspeople's hostility had been replaced by the Lakota's suspicion, and the stakes seemed even higher. That night, listening to the camp settling for sleep, Eliza made a silent promise to herself and Thomas. She would find a way to prove herself worthy of the chance Wicasa had given her. She would learn the necessary skills, earn the respect of people who had reluctantly given her shelter, and build a future for her son. But first, she would have to survive long enough to make good on that promise. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, when the camp was just beginning to stir. Eliza was feeding Thomas when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats and crack of gunfire from the eastern edge. She looked up to see 6 mounted men riding hard toward the center, their faces covered with bandanas and weapons drawn. "Raiders," someone shouted in both English and Lakota. Everyone to cover. Eliza's first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The small shelter offered no protection against bullets, and open ground would leave her exposed. Instead, she quickly strapped Thomas to her back, using the shawl that had served as his blanket. One raider threw a torch onto the barn roof, where the camp stored hay. The dry material caught immediately, sending smoke and sparks into the morning air. Flames spread quickly, threatening to consume the entire structure and precious feed stored inside. Glowing embers began to drift on the wind, some landing on nearby structures and starting smaller fires. Through the chaos, Eliza saw a young Lakota boy stumble and fall near the burning barn. A flying ember had caught his shirt, and he was beating frantically at the flames while crying out in pain. The other defenders were engaged in fighting off attackers and had not seen his predicament. Without thinking, Eliza ran toward the child. Heat from the burning barn was intense, and she could feel flames singeing her hair as she reached him. She used her shawl to smother the fire on his clothing, then helped him to his feet. "Can you run?" she asked, checking his burns. They were minor, but the boy was shaking with fear. He nodded, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. Together, they ran toward the relative safety of the main camp, where other women were gathering the children behind the strongest lodge. But as they reached the central area, another crisis unfolded. A group of young children were huddled near the fire pit, too frightened to move. One raider had spotted them and was riding directly toward them, his rifle raised and ready to fire. Eliza did not hesitate. She pushed the boy she had rescued toward the other women and ran toward the threatened children. "This way," she shouted, waving her arms. "Run to the lodge." The children scattered in different directions, but one little girl froze in terror as the raider's horse thundered toward her. Eliza reached the child just as the man's rifle fired the bullet, passing so close she felt the heat of it. She swept the girl up and rolled behind a large water barrel, both of them landing hard as the raider's horse crashed into the obstacle. Water cascaded everywhere, soaking them both as the rider was thrown to the ground. The man scrambled to his feet, raising his rifle again. But before he could fire, Wicasa appeared with his own weapon. The two men faced each other briefly, then Wicasa's rifle spoke. The raider fell and did not move. "Are you hurt?" Wicasa asked, helping Eliza to her feet. "No," she gasped, checking to make sure Thomas was still secure and the little girl was unharmed. "But there are more coming." The battle was brief, but intense. The raiders had not expected such organized resistance, and when 3 of their number were killed or wounded, the remaining attackers retreated. They rode away as quickly as they had come, leaving behind destruction and several injured people. As the camp assessed damage, Eliza found herself the object of new attention. The boy she had rescued was the grandson of a tribal elder, and the little girl she had saved was Ashki's great-niece. Word of her actions spread quickly, and hostile looks were replaced by expressions of grudging respect. "You risked your life for our children," said the elder whose grandson had been saved. "This is not something we will forget." Even Ashki seemed to soften. She approached Eliza as the camp cleaned up and offered her a cup of herbal tea. "You fought to protect our young ones," the older woman said. "All of them, not just your own. This shows character." But relief at gaining acceptance was short-lived. As defenders examined the area where raiders had attacked, they made a disturbing discovery. One attacker had dropped a leather satchel during the retreat, and inside were several items that revealed the assault's true nature. Wicasa called a meeting of the tribal council that evening, and Eliza was invited to attend. Adults gathered in a circle around the central fire, and Wicasa placed the recovered items where everyone could see them. "These men were not random bandits," he announced. "They were sent by people in Crow's Landing." He held up a folded piece of paper sealed with wax. "This is a letter of instruction written by someone literate. It tells the attackers which buildings to target and which people to avoid harming." Eliza felt her stomach drop. "What does it say?" Wicasa unfolded the paper and began reading. Strike the horse barn first to create confusion. Drive the Indians away from the eastern grazing lands. Make it look like a random attack, but focus on destroying their food supplies and livestock. Signed, M.W. M.W. Eliza repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Whitmore. The preacher. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The man who had given her a blanket and spoken of Christian charity was the same man who had organized an attack on the people who had given her shelter. His kindness had been a facade designed to maintain his reputation while he worked to drive the Lakota from their lands. Why, she asked, though she already suspected the answer. The grazing lands to the east are some of the best in the territory. Wicasa explained. If my people can be driven away, they will be available for white settlers to claim. The preacher owned significant property in town, and he would profit greatly from expanding the settlement. The hypocrisy made Eliza sick. Whitmore had portrayed himself as a man of God while secretly orchestrating violence against innocent people. His gift of the blanket had been nothing more than a way to ease his conscience while planning more serious crimes. There's more, Wicasa continued. The letter mentions that the presence of a white woman in our camp provides additional justification for the attack. They can claim they were trying to rescue you from savage kidnappers. The implications were clear. Eliza's presence had brought trouble to the camp, just as Ashki had predicted. But instead of being unintended, it had been deliberately exploited by the preacher and his conspirators. I should leave, Eliza said, standing. I should go back to town and tell them I was never in harm's way here. You will not survive one day in that town, Ashki said firmly. They will silence you permanently to protect their secrets. Ashki is right. Wicasa agreed. You know too much about their plans. Your testimony could expose the preacher to authorities who might not be part of the conspiracy. As the meeting continued late into the night, Eliza realized her personal struggles had become part of a much larger conflict. The hostility she had faced in Crow's Landing was not just about her individual circumstances, it was part of a systematic effort to claim Native American lands and resources. When the council finally dispersed, Wicasa walked her back to her shelter. The camp was quiet, but she could sense tension in the air. Everyone knew the attack had been just the beginning. What happens now, she asked. Now we prepare. Wicasa replied. The preacher will not give up easily. He has had a taste of success, and he will want more. The second attack came not with thunder of hoofbeats, but with the insidious creep of poison through the camp's food supply. 3 days after the raid, children began falling ill with stomach cramps and fever. At first, the symptoms seemed mild, perhaps something they had eaten or a minor sickness that would pass. But as more people became affected, it became clear something serious was happening. Eliza was among the first to notice the pattern. Thomas had been fussing more than usual, and when she checked their water supply, she detected a strange, bitter taste. She immediately stopped giving him the water and sought out Wicasa. Something is wrong with the water, she told him urgently. I think it's been tampered with. Wicasa gathered several experienced hunters and trackers, and they began a systematic search of the area around the camp. What they found confirmed Eliza's suspicions. Someone had been there during the night, someone who knew the camp's layout well enough to find the main water source and contaminate it with a mixture of bitter herbs and mineral compounds. This is not the work of mounted raiders, declared Lakota, who had found tracks leading to and from the poisoned spring. This person came alone on foot and knew exactly where to go. The discovery sent a chill through the camp. A mounted attack was one thing, it was direct visible and could be defended against. But a poisoner who could slip into the camp undetected was far more serious. Anyone could be the next victim, and there was no way to guard against an enemy who struck in darkness and silence. As the day wore on, more evidence of poisoning came to light. Several food storage areas showed signs of contamination, and hay in the rebuilt barn had been treated with substances that would sicken the animals. The poisoner had been thorough and methodical, targeting multiple aspects of the camp's survival. But it was the discovery of a second letter that truly shocked everyone. This one had been left deliberately where it would be found pinned to a tree just outside the camp's perimeter. Unlike the first letter, which had been dropped accidentally, this one was clearly meant to be read. Wicasa gathered the tribal council again, his face grim. He unfolded the letter and began reading aloud to the savage inhabitants of this illegal camp. He began, his voice steady, but his eyes showing anger. You have chosen to harbor a white woman and her child against the will of Christian people. This is an act of war against civilization itself. He paused, looking around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. The sickness that has come upon you is a warning. Return the woman to town immediately, or face the consequences of your defiance. This land belongs to God's chosen people, not to those who worship false spirits. The letter was signed with the same initials, M.W., Marcus Whitmore. Eliza said, her voice bitter with betrayal, but Wicasa was not finished reading. There is more, he said, his voice growing even more serious. A postscript written in different handwriting. He held the paper closer to the fire. The poisoning was a test of our resolve. If the woman is not returned within 3 days, we will escalate our methods. We have allies in the territorial government who will support our actions. The implications were staggering. The preacher was not acting alone. He had support from government officials who could legitimize his actions as law enforcement rather than vigilante violence. Worse, the poisoning had been a deliberate escalation designed to show that the attackers could strike any time without warning. Eliza felt responsibility settling on her shoulders like a crushing weight. Her decision to stay had put everyone at risk, and now children were sick because of her presence. The guilt was almost overwhelming. There's something I need to tell you, she said, her voice carrying across the camp. Something about the preacher that might change how we understand this situation. She turned to face the council, and in the firelight, they could see tears streaming down her face. When I first arrived in Crow's Landing, I was desperate and frightened. The preacher found me in the cemetery, and he took me to his house. The revelation sent shock through the gathered people. This was the first time Eliza had mentioned being inside the preacher's home. He gave me food and a place to sleep, she continued. But in exchange, he wanted things. Things that a man of God should not want from a woman in my position. The implication was clear, and several council members exchanged glances of understanding and disgust. I refused him. Eliza said, her voice growing stronger. I told him I would rather starve than compromise myself that way. That's when he threw me out and began spreading rumors about me being unfit and troublesome. She paused, gathering strength for the most difficult part. But before he threw me out, I saw something in his study. Maps of this area with marks showing Native American lands, and correspondence with territorial officials about plans for expanding white settlements. He has been planning this for months. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone understood the implications of what Eliza had revealed. The preacher's actions were not motivated by religious conviction. They were part of a calculated plan to seize valuable land and resources. He is using his position as a religious leader to cover his true motivations. Wicasa said, he can claim to be acting in God's name while pursuing personal gain. And now we know why he escalated to poisoning, added Lakota. He wants to cause maximum suffering without direct confrontation. He wants to break our will to resist. As the council discussed options, Eliza realized her personal struggle had become part of a much larger story. She was not just a widow trying to survive. She was a symbol of resistance against corruption and greed. Her refusal to compromise her principles had made her an enemy of powerful men who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. As the meeting broke up, Wicasa approached her with a serious expression. "You understand this information makes you even more vulnerable to them," he said. "You are now a witness to their plans, not just a victim of their prejudice." "I understand," Eliza replied. "And I understand there's no going back now. Whatever happens, I'm committed to seeing this through." The fever that swept through the camp in the following days was unlike anything Eliza had experienced. It started with the youngest children, who had been most affected by the contaminated water, but soon spread to adults as well. The symptoms were severe high fever delirium and a rash that spread across victims' bodies. Thomas was among the first to fall ill, and watching her son suffer was agony. He would not eat, could barely keep water down, and his small body burned with fever that no amount of cool cloths could reduce. She held him constantly, but his condition continued to deteriorate. "It's not a natural sickness," announced Ayana, an elderly woman who served as the camp's primary healer. "The poison has created an infection in the blood. Without proper medicine, many will die." The nearest doctor was in Crow's Landing, but seeking help, there would be walking into a trap. The territorial capital was 3 days' ride away, and they had no guarantee that officials there would help Native Americans. As more people fell ill, the camp's ability to function broke down. Healthy adults were overwhelmed trying to care for the sick, and essential tasks were neglected. The horses and other animals, also affected by poisoned feed, were weakening. Eliza found herself caring for others, despite her own exhaustion and Thomas's needs. She had some nursing experience from her childhood, when her mother had cared for sick neighbors during an epidemic. "You should rest," Ashki told her, as she found Eliza changing bandages on a young warrior who had developed infected sores. "You are weak yourself, and your child needs you." "My child needs all of us to survive," Eliza replied, continuing her work. "And I can't rest while there's something I can do to help." But her efforts were taking a toll. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and her milk supply was dwindling. Thomas's condition worsened daily, and she began to fear she would lose him as she had lost Samuel. It was during this crisis that Sheriff Walt Brennan arrived with several men under a flag of truce, claiming to be concerned about the humanitarian crisis affecting the area. "We've heard there's sickness here," Brennan announced from horseback just outside the camp. "We've come to offer assistance." Wicasa, despite his own weakness from fever, met them with a small group of warriors. "What kind of assistance?" "Medical supplies," Brennan replied, "and safe passage to the territorial capital for anyone who needs treatment." The offer sounded reasonable, but Eliza noticed that Jake Morrison, one of the cowboys who had tried to take Thomas, was with the sheriff. His presence suggested this was not a genuine rescue mission. "We also understand you have a white woman and child here," Brennan continued. "Eliza Bannon and her son. We're prepared to take them back to town for proper medical care. The woman and child are under my protection." Wicasa replied firmly. "I'm afraid that's not possible." Brennan said, his tone hardening. "We have reports that Mrs. Bannon is being held against her will." "I'll speak for myself," Eliza said, stepping forward despite her weakness. "I am here by choice. These people have treated me with more kindness than I ever received in your town." "You don't look well, Mrs. Bannon," Brennan observed. "Are you sure you're thinking clearly?" "I'm thinking clearly enough to know this sickness started after someone poisoned our water supply," Eliza replied. "And I'm thinking clearly enough to know who was responsible." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but several of his men shifted uncomfortably. "That's a serious accusation." "Do you have proof?" "I have a letter signed by Marcus Whitmore," Eliza said boldly. A letter that describes the poisoning as a warning. For a moment, Brennan looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened again. Reverend Whitmore is a respected member of our community. I find it hard to believe he would be involved in such actions. The confrontation was interrupted by commotion from within the camp. One of the younger children had gone into convulsions from fever. His mother was screaming for help, and several adults were trying to hold him down. "Help him!" Eliza shouted, turning toward the sound of distress. But there was little that could be done. The child's fever was too high, and without proper medicine, his body was shutting down. Within minutes, the convulsions stopped, and the boy lay still. The silence that followed was deafening. The death was murder, pure and simple. The boy had died because of the preacher's poison, and now the sheriff was trying to claim credit for offering help. And this is what your concerned citizens have done. Wicasa said, his voice filled with cold fury. They have murdered children. Leave, he added. Leave now before I forget the laws of hospitality. The sheriff and his men withdrew, but not before Brennan delivered a final warning. We'll be back, Mrs. Bannon. And next time, we might not be so understanding. That night, as she held Thomas's fevered body and listened to sounds of mourning throughout the camp, Eliza made a decision that would change everything. She could not allow more children to die, and she could not allow the preacher to escape justice. She would have to find a way to get evidence to authorities who were not part of the conspiracy. But first, she needed medicine to save Thomas and the other children. There is a medicine, Ashki told her quietly. A white man's medicine that might help. But it is in the town, and getting it would be extremely risky. What kind of medicine? Eliza asked. Quinine, Ashki replied. The doctor in Crow's Landing has it, but he would never give it to help Native Americans. Eliza felt a spark of determination. What if I went to get it? I'm white, he might not suspect me. You would be walking into a trap, Ashki warned. They want you alive, but only to use you. Once you serve their purposes, you will be eliminated. Then I'll have to make sure I don't serve their purposes. Eliza said, her mind already working on a plan. The next morning, while the camp was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, Eliza set out for Crow's Landing. She had left Thomas in Ashki's care, knowing that the older woman would do everything possible to keep him alive while she was gone. She approached the town from the east, using the cover of cottonwood trees along the creek to avoid being seen. The doctor's office was a small building attached to his residence, and she could see light in the windows despite the early hour. Eliza had no money to pay for the medicine, and she knew the doctor would not give it to her if he knew it was for the Lakota. That left her with only one option: she would have to steal it. The back door to the office was secured with a simple latch. She used her knife to work it free, then slipped inside as quietly as possible. The office was larger than it appeared from outside, with shelves lined with bottles and jars of various medicines. She found the quinine quickly, a large bottle with a handwritten label. She also took some willow bark extract and laudanum, knowing these would help with pain and fever. As she prepared to leave, she heard footsteps approaching. Dr. Harrison was coming to check on something, and she had nowhere to hide. In desperation, she slipped behind a large cabinet and held her breath. The doctor entered and went directly to his desk, where he began writing in a ledger. Eliza could see him clearly, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes. Under different circumstances, she might have trusted him with the truth. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Harrison finished and left the room. Eliza waited several more minutes before emerging and making her way back to the door. But as she reached for the latch, she heard voices outside. Saw someone moving around back here, came a man's voice. Could be prowlers. Or it could be that Bannon woman, came another voice. Sheriff said to keep an eye out for her. Eliza's heart began to pound as she realized she had been spotted. She looked around frantically, searching for another way out. There was a window on the far side of the room, but it was small and would require her to climb over the doctor's desk. The voices were getting closer. She had no choice. She climbed onto the desk as quietly as possible and began working the window latch. The window was stuck probably from years of disuse. She put all her strength into it, and finally it gave way, with a loud creak. The sound echoed through the morning air, and she heard the voices outside grow more urgent. Eliza squeezed through the window and dropped to the ground outside. She landed hard, jarring her spine, but managed to keep silent and began running toward the tree line. Behind her, she could hear the men entering the doctor's office and discovering the theft. Their shouts would soon bring more people, and she had to get as far away as possible. The run back to the camp was the longest of her life. She had to stay off the main trail using game paths and creek beds to avoid detection. The stolen medicines weighed heavily in her pack, but she dared not rest. She reached the camp just as the sun was setting, exhausted and dehydrated, but triumphant. The medicine was exactly what they needed, and within hours of administering it, several of the sickest children began to show improvement. Thomas's fever broke completely, and he began eating and sleeping normally again. Eliza wept with relief as she watched her son return to health, but her success had come at a terrible cost. Her theft had been discovered, and now the entire town knew she was still alive and actively working against them. The preacher would use this as evidence of her criminal behavior, and any chance of peaceful resolution was gone. As she held Thomas and watched the other children recover, Eliza realized that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. She was no longer just a victim of circumstances, she was an active participant in a war between two ways of life. The final battle was coming the very next night. The attack on the Lakota camp came at midnight, when the defenders were weakest from days of fighting the fever and caring for the sick. The sound that announced the assault was not the thunder of hoofbeats, but the crackle of flames as torches were thrown onto the roofs of the camp's buildings. Marcus Whitmore had assembled a mob of nearly 30 men, all armed with rifles and filled with righteous fury. Thick smoke began to pour from multiple fires as his voice boomed across the camp. "Come out, you savages, come out and face the judgment of God." Eliza was in Ashki's lodge checking on Thomas and other recovering children when the attack began. The stolen medicine had worked, Thomas's fever had broken completely, and several children were beginning to recover. But now, all that progress was threatened. "Take the children to the root cellar." Ashki commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Keep them quiet and keep them safe." "I'm not hiding," Eliza said, strapping Thomas to her back and picking up a rifle. "I'm done running from these people." "You will die," Ashki warned. "And your death will accomplish nothing." "Maybe," Eliza replied, checking her weapon. "But at least I'll die fighting for something that matters." The battle that followed was unlike anything in Eliza's experience. The mob had advantages of numbers and preparation, but the Lakota defenders knew their ground and were fighting for their homes and families. The narrow spaces between buildings forced attackers to come in small groups rather than overwhelming with superior numbers. Wicasa positioned himself at the main entrance, directing the defense despite his weakness from fever. He moved with the deadly precision of a warrior who had survived countless battles. "They're trying to surround us," he called out through the thickening smoke. "Keep them channeled through the main approaches." Eliza found herself fighting alongside Lakota and two other warriors defending the eastern approach where the mob was trying to break through. The attackers were using burning buildings as cover, advancing through smoke and flames that grew denser by the minute. The heat was intense, and smoke burned her lungs as she tried to aim through the chaos. Her eyes watered constantly, making it difficult to see targets clearly. Bullets splintered wood near her head, sending fragments flying in all directions. She ducked behind a water trough, her heart pounding as she tried to line up a shot. The smoke was so thick now that she could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The acrid smell made her gag, and she had to fight the urge to cough and give away her position. She squeezed the trigger, her rifle kicking against her shoulder. Through the haze, she saw one of the attackers stumble and fall. The battle raged with increasing intensity. Flames spread from building to building, creating a maze of fire and smoke that made it difficult to breathe, let alone fight effectively. The acrid smell of burning wood mixed with gunpowder, creating an atmosphere that seemed to come straight from hell. Bullets flew constantly now, whining past her head and splintering wood all around her. She could hear Thomas crying on her back, terrified by the noise and smoke. One bullet passed so close to her face that she felt the heat of it against her cheek. It was then that Eliza saw Marcus Whitmore himself advancing through the smoke. The preacher's face was twisted with hatred and fury, and he was heading directly toward the lodge where the sick children were sheltered. His rifle was raised, and she could see the determination in his eyes. He intended to kill every person in that building. Without thinking, Eliza broke from her position and ran toward him. Bullets whined past her head constantly as other mob members tried to stop her. One grazed her shoulder, tearing through her dress and leaving a burning streak of pain. Another passed so close to Thomas that she felt it tug at the shawl, holding him to her back. She stumbled but kept running, her heart pounding as she realized how close she had come to losing her son. The smoke was so thick she could barely see, and she nearly ran into a burning beam that had fallen from one of the buildings. "Stop!" she shouted, raising her rifle as she finally reached Whitmore. "Leave them alone." Whitmore turned toward her, his eyes wide with surprise and anger. "You," he snarled. "You're the cause of all this trouble. You should have accepted my offer when you had the chance." "Your offer?" Eliza laughed bitterly, even as flames roared around them, and smoke made her eyes stream with tears. "You mean your attempt to force yourself on me in exchange for basic human decency?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Several mob members who were close enough to hear through the smoke looked shocked, and Eliza realized they had not known the true nature of the preacher's relationship with her. "You're lying," Whitmore said. But his voice lacked conviction as he noticed the expressions on his followers' faces. "You're a desperate woman who will say anything to save herself. I'm a woman who refused to compromise her principles." Eliza replied, her rifle still trained on him despite the chaos around them. "And I'm a woman who has evidence of your crimes." She reached into her jacket and pulled out the letter they had found after the first attack. "This letter details your plans to drive the Lakota from their land through violence and terrorism." Whitmore's face went pale as he realized the implications. If word of his involvement reached territorial authorities, he would face serious criminal charges. His reputation, position, and land schemes would all be destroyed. "Give me that letter," he demanded, raising his rifle. "Give it to me now, or I'll kill you and your child where you stand. If you kill me, you'll have to explain to the territorial government why you murdered a white woman and her child." Eliza replied, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. "Even your political connections won't be able to cover that up." The standoff continued for several tense moments. Around them, other battles were raging through the smoke. But in this small space, surrounded by flames and choking fumes, the conflict had been reduced to its essential elements: a corrupt man's lust for power against a principled woman's refusal to submit. It was then that Eliza made her most shocking discovery. As she watched Whitmore's face in the flickering light of the burning buildings, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Pinned to his jacket was a small silver badge that glinted in the firelight, the badge of a territorial deputy marshal. "You're not just a preacher," she said, her voice filled with horrified realization. "You're a law enforcement officer." Whitmore smiled coldly through the smoke. "I am both," he said. "And that gives me the authority to do whatever is necessary to maintain order in this territory." The revelation explained everything. Whitmore had not just been planning to steal Native American land, he had been doing so with the full backing of the territorial government. His position as deputy marshal gave him legal authority to justify his actions as law enforcement rather than vigilante violence. You planned all of this. Eliza said, the pieces falling into place even as smoke made her dizzy. The rejection by the townspeople, the attacks on the camp, even the poisoning. You wanted to create a crisis that would justify forcible removal of the Lakota. I wanted to create progress. Whitmore replied, his badge catching the light of the flames. This land is too valuable to be wasted on savages who don't understand private property. Your presence here gave me the perfect excuse to take action. And when I refused your advances, you decided to make an example of me as well. Eliza said, feeling her strength beginning to ebb from smoke inhalation. Two birds with one stone: get rid of the Native Americans and punish the woman who rejected you. You could have had a comfortable life. Whitmore said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded self-pity. Instead, you chose to throw your lot in with these heathens. Now you'll die with them. He raised his rifle, but Eliza was faster. She pulled the trigger, and her bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, blood streaming down his arm. But even as he fell, Whitmore pulled a pistol from his belt with his good hand. You should have taken my offer, he gasped, raising the weapon toward Thomas. The pistol fired, and Eliza felt a searing pain in her thigh as the bullet tore through her leg. She stumbled backward, her vision going gray from the pain and smoke. Blood began to seep through her dress, and she could feel her strength ebbing quickly. But she managed to stay upright long enough to fire again. This time, her bullet struck Whitmore in the chest when he collapsed, his pistol falling from his hand. Another bullet from one of the mob members caught her in the same leg, higher up near the hip. White-hot pain shot through her entire body, and she fell to her knees. Blood was flowing freely now, soaking her dress and pooling on the ground beneath her. She could feel herself getting weaker with each passing second. Thomas was crying on her back, and she could feel his small body shaking with fear. She tried to stand, but her wounded leg would not support her weight. She fell again, this time onto her side, careful to protect Thomas as she went down. The world was spinning, and she could feel consciousness slipping away. But then she heard a new sound. Through the smoke and flames, the arrival of more riders approaching the camp. Marshal David Crawford, Federal Authority. A voice boomed through the chaos. All combatants will cease fire immediately. The fighting gradually died down as both sides recognized the authority of the federal marshals. But Eliza was barely conscious now, her vision fading in and out as blood loss took its toll. She could see figures moving through the smoke, but they seemed distant and unreal. Marshal Crawford. She managed to call out weakly, holding up the incriminating letter with a trembling hand. I have evidence. This man's crimes. Deputy Marshal. Organizing attacks. The federal marshal approached cautiously, his weapon drawn. Through the smoke, she could see him examining the letter, his expression growing more serious with each line. These are serious charges. He said finally, his voice seeming to come from very far away. Deputy Marshal Whitmore, you're under arrest for abuse of federal authority and conspiracy to commit murder. But Whitmore was beyond arrest. The 2 bullets had done their work, and he lay motionless in the dirt, his deputy marshal badge still pinned to his blood-soaked jacket. As the federal marshals took control of the situation, Eliza felt herself slipping away. The pain in her leg was becoming distant, and she could feel herself growing cold, despite the heat of the flames. Thomas was still crying on her back, and she used her last reserves of strength to reach behind her and pat him gently. It's over, she whispered, though she was not sure if she was talking to Thomas or to herself. It's finally over. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the faces of the mob members as they stared at Whitmore's body and realized they had been following a corrupt lawman who had deceived them all. The aftermath of the battle left the Lakota camp in ruins, but it also brought an unexpected opportunity for justice. Eliza awoke 3 days later in a makeshift hospital that had been set up in one of the few buildings that had survived the fire. Her leg was heavily bandaged, and she was told that she would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. But she was alive. Dr. Harrison, the same doctor whose office she had burglarized, was tending to her wounds. "You lost a lot of blood," he said gently. "But you're going to be fine. Your son is healthy and safe." Thomas was indeed safe, sleeping peacefully in a small bed next to hers. The sight of him unharmed and breathing normally made all the pain and suffering worthwhile. "I was told you were being held against your will." Dr. Harrison continued, his voice filled with shame. "I was told the Lakota were ruthless savages who needed to be dealt with. I now understand I was lied to." The doctor's change of heart had been prompted by his conversation with Marshal Crawford, who had made it clear that the federal government did not support the actions taken against the Lakota. More importantly, several townspeople had been horrified to learn about Whitmore's true motivations and his abuse of his position. "We didn't know," said Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the general store owner, who had come with a group of townspeople bringing supplies. "We thought we were protecting our community from criminals. We didn't know we were helping a man commit crimes against innocent people." The apologies were genuine, but they could not undo the damage. Children had died, homes had been destroyed, and trust between communities had been shattered. But the gesture of bringing supplies and medical aid was a start. Marshal Crawford spent the following weeks investigating the full extent of the corruption. Whitmore's death had opened the floodgates, and several other territorial officials were found to be involved in similar land-grabbing schemes. This investigation has led to the arrest of 3 territorial officials and the suspension of 7 others. Crawford told Eliza during one of their interviews, "Your testimony and the evidence you preserved have been crucial in exposing this corruption. The tribal council met several times to decide their future. Some members wanted to move to a more remote location, while others argued for staying and rebuilding. Wicasa, despite his own injuries, emerged as a strong advocate for staying. If we run every time corrupt officials abuse their power, he argued, we will have no home left to run to. This land is ours by right, and we should not abandon it because of criminals' actions." As discussions continued, Eliza found herself consulted about the community's future. Her knowledge of white society and her experience with government bureaucracy made her a valuable advisor despite her injuries. "I think you should stay," she told the council. "Not because it's safe, but because running away gives the corrupt officials exactly what they want." The council ultimately decided to stay and rebuild with new safeguards and federal protection in place. The federal government agreed to station a permanent marshal in the area, and reform-minded officials were appointed to replace the corrupt ones. For Eliza, the decision meant she would continue to face the challenges of living between 2 worlds, but she had found a place where her outsider status was seen as a strength rather than a weakness. 3 months after the battle, she testified at a formal territorial hearing in Cheyenne. Walking with her new limp, she told the complete story of the corruption and violence that had nearly destroyed both communities. Deputy Marshal Whitmore made it clear he had political support for his actions. She testified. He said the territorial government wanted to remove Native Americans from valuable land, and that my presence in the camp gave him the perfect excuse to use violence. The hearing resulted in sweeping reforms and new oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses. When Eliza returned to the camp, she found that the rebuilding had progressed remarkably well. New buildings combined traditional techniques with modern methods, creating a community that was both culturally authentic and practically designed for frontier challenges. Most surprisingly, children from Crow's Landing were playing with Lakota children, their laughter filling the air. Their parents stood nearby chatting with tribal elders about farming and trade. The 2 communities were learning to work together. It started with the supplies they brought after the battle, Ashki explained. Some of the townspeople were genuinely horrified when they learned what Whitmore had been doing. They wanted to make amends. As the years passed, Eliza served as a bridge between the communities, helping to resolve conflicts and build understanding. Her story became a legend in the territory, the woman who had stood up to corruption and helped bring two communities together. Thomas grew up bilingual, comfortable in both worlds, and proud of his unique heritage. The proposal came on a warm summer evening when Eliza was 35 years old. She was sitting by the fire with Ashki, watching Thomas play with other children when Wicasa approached with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, his usual confidence replaced by nervousness. "About what kind of legacy we want to leave for our children. And I realized I don't want to face that future alone." He paused, looking directly at her. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. Not because you need protection, but because I love you, and I want to build the rest of our lives together." Eliza felt her heart skip a beat. She had developed deep feelings for Wicasa over the years, but had never allowed herself to hope. "I love you too," she said simply. "I have for a long time." The wedding ceremony was a beautiful blend of traditions. They were married according to Lakota customs, with Ashki performing the ritual, and also had a civil ceremony performed by Marshal Crawford. The entire community celebrated the union, with people from both the Lakota camp and Crow's Landing joining in the festivities. It was a powerful symbol of how far they had all come from the dark days of conflict and mistrust. As Eliza and Wicasa stood together under the stars, surrounded by their friends and family, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a desperate widow, with no prospects, rejected by society, and facing an uncertain future. Now she was a respected leader, a mother to a thriving son and a wife to a man she deeply loved. The transformation had not been easy. It had required determination, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand up for her principles even when it would have been easier to compromise. But it had also been deeply rewarding, giving her a sense of purpose and belonging that she had never experienced before. As the celebration continued around them, Eliza looked up at the stars and made a silent promise. She would continue to fight for justice and equality, to serve as a bridge between communities, and to build a future where children like Thomas could grow up free from the prejudice and corruption that had nearly destroyed their world. The story of her struggles was over, but the story of her contributions to building a better world was just beginning. And she was ready for whatever challenges that future might bring. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying new settlers west toward their own dreams and struggles. But here in this place, surrounded by the people who had become her family, Eliza Bannon Red Hawk had found something that no amount of gold or land could buy: a home where she truly belonged.